So part two of our program is we're going to watch Jackson and Brice interact with each other based on what they told you. And I'm supposed to stimulate that discussion, and I found that I don't know where to start because they were so fertile and dense with ideas. So I'm just going to
30%. So there are a couple of ways that I think that there are some big elements that could happen. We do have a fairly old major building infrastructure. So we have some huge sort of low-hanging fruit, as they call it. So for instance, SUNY Cortland until very recently was heated by a central heating plant where we burned natural gas to heat the entire campus. So it was burned in one place and shipped off. In the wintertime, you could see where the steam pipes were because there was no snow on the ground there. They replaced those with satellite boilers, and we reduced our gas consumption this winter by almost 40%. And so it's a very, very big change there. There is an enormous inefficiency in a lot of the older housing stocks. The real question is how you get the economic incentive, particularly for renters, when you have that kind of disconnect between who pays the energy bill and who owns the building. One of our students, though, he did a project in one of our classes to look at air sealing in the building he rents, and we found holes to the outside. And he approached the landlord, we ran the numbers for them, and he was willing to allow him to make the investment and take the energy savings out of his rent. And so there were some pretty big possibilities, I think, particularly with some of the older housing stock. I think the physics works pretty well. The big question for me is how you get to the economic incentives.
Jackson.
Yeah. So if I get where you're going with this, I think the idea, just to be clear on the potential that we're talking about, that's end use efficiency, right? That's where you're going with this? Yeah, so I think there is a lot that needs to be done on the other end of the equation, but from our perspective, you need to do all of it, but there's so much ridiculously cost-effective resources on end-use efficiency along the lines of what Brice mentioned. You're talking 2-3 cents a kilowatt hour to acquire that efficiency, and it's easier said than done. I mean, you see those numbers thrown. It's like, wow, efficiency is so cheap. Like, why isn't it just happening like magically? And there's issues like the split incentives challenge, where if somebody's paying the utility bill and the renter, that disconnect is an issue. But I think it's a really good point, because you can throw all the money in the world at efficiency, and if your programs aren't smartly designed and your criteria for deciding what you can spend that money on is flawed, then you're not going to have an efficient program that captures all cost-effective energy efficiency. And so that's a lot of the down-in-the-weeds work that we do at the Public Service Commission, really drilling into how do you decide what projects are eligible to be funded. And that all comes down to where the rubber hits the road. What is your cost and what are your benefits? And if you're undervaluing the value of a ton of CO2 or a ton of greenhouse gases that you've mitigated by that efficiency investment, you turn that dial alone and have it reflect the actual impacts of climate change, and the universe of what's cost effective is dramatically larger. And so I think a key thing to keep in mind is we need to get that bogey right, because right now we're dramatically undervaluing the value of efficiency and reducing demand for electricity and giving a free pass to rate basing, centralized fossil plants and gas pipeline. So I'm not even sure if I answered your question.
No, you did. And more importantly, you gave the audience some things to think about. One more enticing issue, and I can't think of which one to use because they're all neat. So I'm curious, and I gotta admit, I have a conflict of interest in this question. So I'm the 13th author on the Jacobson report. I don't know if anybody noticed that, but there are 13 co-authors, and I'm number 13. How could 13 people working for 6 months come up with a plan in New York State, take 7,000 pages and come up with a dictionary? How'd that happen?
I don't have the answer, but you should probably ask it in Syracuse tomorrow.
Okay. It's time for audience interaction, because if I go any farther, I'll probably go off the deep end here. So, please, you've heard wonderful presentations from two fantastically knowledgeable people. I think they proved that to you. They've read this plan inside and out. They've dissected it, they've analyzed it, and they pointed out the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so now it's time for you to take advantage of their wisdom and expertise and ask them questions. So please, if you have a question, come forward, identify yourself if you'd like, please.
I'll take the advantage of being close. Dr. Brice, I have two questions. One is, have you considered in the development of SUNY the online education factor? That's okay. That was the first question. And the second question is, and I don't know if that's appropriate for this place, but a thorium liquid fuel reactor. Have you taken that into consideration in your nuclear understanding of things or analysis?
So the first one is a lot easier, so I'll start with that. In terms of online education, it is something that we see having significant effects down, in the not too distant future. There are certainly positives to it, particularly when you think about student access, not having to be in a particular location like Central New York to take advantage of programs as they come online, particularly as there are very few programs in a particular area like renewable energy. The other advantage is, of course, it cuts down on transit, that our students are driving to campus every day and then driving back home. Graduate students are all commuters. On the flip side, no one has really figured out how to make a lab online yet. And so a lot of our coursework is really, touching the buildings that we're doing, wanting to touch the solar panels and shade them and see what happens. So with our discipline in particular, online education is still something people are kind of looking at how those hybrid models, so online during the year, and then you bring everyone in the summer to do the lab experiences in a concentrated way. Those are still being worked out. In terms of the nuclear fuel cycle, he references one of the alternatives to the current uranium-based light water reactors, which dominate the U.S. The thorium reactors, they've been looked at quite a lot. India was very interested in them. They really have never been proposed for commercial development in any kind of time frame that climate change cares about, sort of the next 50 years. And that was always been my criteria. If it's not a viable technology to fix climate change, I never really looked at whether it had other technical advantages. It was too far in the future.
While we're waiting for the next question, can I just make a comment?
Sure.
So one thing that Brice raised a lot of great stuff, but one thing in particular that I wanted to flag, and that's why I sound like a broken record, but I kept bringing back the Climate Action Plan as kind of a more comprehensive look that looked at some of the scoping issues you mentioned, and probably also because I spent hundreds of hours as an advisor on the buildings group of that plan. But one piece that was good about that is that NYSERDA in that process, getting to this idea of, okay, there's no mention of fracking in the plan, and yet there's a lot of mention of increased use of natural gas in New York from other places. And it wasn't perfect, but you did see NYSERDA in the Climate Action Plan attempt to quantify and attribute the greenhouse gas emissions from gas consumed in New York State and attribute that to their profile. Not to get too into it, but there's a structure that EPA utilizes when they address leakage of methane from the transmission and distribution system versus from the extraction process. I won't get into that right now, but the issue is NYSERDA was essentially using a similar approach in the Climate Action Plan and accounting for nationally what the leakage rates were for transmission and distribution of natural gas. They then factored in how much natural gas was being consumed in New York State, both for heating, for power plants, all the rest. And then they backed out a number that they attributed to New York State, had New York State own that as emissions attributable to the state. Again, everything I just said was in the Climate Action Plan, not in the State Energy Plan, but I'm flagging that there is precedent and that's a way that you can better attribute and then address the emissions that you should account for from New York. And then that's the first step, because if you don't do that step right, you're never going to do the reductions right. So I just wanted to flag that because it's a really, really, really important point.
Hi, my name's Mafamli Flynn. I have the luxury of having had my grandfather be a senior agricultural economic advisor to the White House during certain years, so I've heard a few things along the way, and I was just wondering, when in the geothermal sector, is there any potential for capturing the LLRs, the low-level radioactive waste sites that don't exist in certain has that been explored? And it's totally not. I just thought I'd take advantage of your.
I would imagine that almost anything that could be explored has been. I've never seen it, though. I would imagine you would have a substantial number of issues penetrating through the engineered barrier. The idea would be to use the waste heat that these wastes are producing to actually capture that as useful heat. But I'm guessing you would run into some pretty serious engineering issues if you tried to do that.
Hi, I'm Peter Gamble. I'm from Branchport, New York, and I'm a member of the Committee to Preserve the Finger Lake. The question I have is, they talk about doing all this stuff. And I've been involved with a lot of small towns and political stuff and everything else. And how are you going to educate the people who run the towns, the code people, how are we going to educate me as a resident and how to move forward in this to make it effective? I watched and listened to your talk about this, and some of it, except for the gas coming back to New York, seems like it's got a lot of positive stuff to it, but I haven't seen any infrastructure on how it's going to be done at the local level.
So building codes is probably one of the most snake-bit cross-jurisdictional challenges that we have to deal with. You've got the Department of State having jurisdiction over building codes and having habitually a lack of funding in the state budget to then implement them effectively. To add to that, the energy efficiency building code piece is part of a much broader just safety and fire code. So you add all that up, and it's really easy to have the efficiency piece of it kind of get lost in the shuffle. But the good news is NYSERDA is working right now with Department of State to actually put together a training module and fund a program that would in fact bring in municipal officials, have the new code book circulated to those officials and provide that feedback. Because you're absolutely right, until we do that, municipalities are struggling just to keep things going, let alone enforce a building code effectively that gets updated every few years if we do what we're supposed to do. So the good news is NYSERDA is working on that plan, and hopefully we'll see it start to roll out once we get the new building codes implemented.
I guess just a follow-up question, and I'll sit down. How are the towns going to be paid? Because right now there's this big tax cap that's being put on all these towns. How are they? I mean, is NYSERDA going to pay them? I mean, is that in the plan?
Right. I don't have the answer to that, but I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Everything has a cost to it, and if you have a tax cap in place, and I think the good news is there are revenue streams, whether you take it from auction of allowances under the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, because the key is you have to link the fact that you can have the best building code in the world, and if it's not enforced, you're getting nothing out of it. And if you can attribute and quantify the efficiency reductions you get and the greenhouse gas reductions you get from that training program, which is different than retrofitting a building, but is just as important, then you can actually justify investing RGGI dollars in that program. You can justify investing energy efficiency dollars in that program. And that's something we would fully support because it's a critical piece, and it's always neglected and always underfunded.
I'm a little short, so I'll take this one. My name is Renee Vogelsang. I work with Frack Action and New Yorkers Against Fracking, and I really appreciate you guys here. Hi. And so thank you for this presentation. But there is one part, and forgive me, I came a little late, so maybe you did address it and I missed it. But I think there's one critical piece that's in this plan that we should all be responding to tomorrow, in my opinion, if we're attending the hearing, and that's that this plan predicts fracking in New York. I don't know if either of you saw that. Keith Shue, an engineer we've been working with out of the Oneonta-Otsego area, has really picked apart this plan, and we've gotten some talking points from him off of this. And specifically, the document forecasts that natural gas production in New York will triple by 2030 with the lifting of the state's current moratorium on high-volume horizontal fracking. The document goes on to say that this is a quote-unquote conservative estimate and that volumes could be even higher if quote-unquote production and permitting difficulties are reduced. So that's in the plan, and I think it's on page 28 or 29. Forgive me if I'm wrong on that page. But I think that the fact that the plan is predicting fracking in New York State is an important piece that we should all be bringing up tomorrow and speaking. And I think that's kind of one of the main red flags that, speaking on behalf of the anti-fracking community, that we're really freaked out about and are going to talk about tomorrow. And I don't know what sort of response you guys have to that or what you've seen on that.
Yeah, this is one of the places where the plan is particularly complicated in the way its language is structured. At heart, it gets back to what Jackson had said, is that really those 900 pages of appendices are reference cases and then qualitative discussions of sort of alternate models. Where she's talking about in the plan is they reference an EIA, an Energy Information Administration study, that uses a national energy model that assumed at some point New York was going to lift its moratorium and then had the production. The plan then says if the moratorium stays, it would go down, and if the moratorium was lifted and everyone loved hydrofracking, it would go even higher. And so in real, sort of at heart, it gets back to this question of the plan that isn't a plan. That it predicts it could go up, it could go down, it could do anything in between. And so it's a very important point because on one of its reference case trajectories to get to some of those increases in gas that it looks at, it does currently have embedded in its business as usual model lifting of that moratorium as one of the reference case scenarios. I don't have it in my slides, but it's definitely referenced in the comments that she discussed. The flip side of that, though, is even if you were on the trajectory where the moratorium wasn't lifted and gas production in New York goes down, if gas consumption goes up, then it's just coming from someone else's shale gas. Right. And so sort of whoever is going to have those well pads, if gas goes up, it's coming from, in large part, from shale, because that's absolutely clear in the plans. And so you can kind of take it at that and avoid some of the complications of how that language is structured, because regardless of which trend it actually followed, if gas consumption goes up, it is going to be from shale.
Well, it was such a good answer. I mean, I think that's, first of all, I was a little nervous because I thought I'd somehow missed a massive statement that New York was going to start fracking tomorrow in the plan, and I should be fired if I read the plan and didn't see that. But that was my confusion. I mean, I think it's a very valid point, and it just goes back to the fact that a lot of this is just saying, well, here's one future, here's another future, here's another future. But I think Brice's point is spot on. And that's what I was getting at when I was trying to focus in the short time we had to go through all of the information that was in there, is that there's direct, obviously, impacts that are very, very important to consider and think about whether that happens in New York or in another state. But from a climate change perspective as a whole, due to the high methane numbers upstream at any wellhead, whether it's across the border or in New York, if that pie at the end is 65 or 70% gas as our electric supply, we're in bad shape. So, I mean, I think it's not that the point that was just raised isn't valid. It's extremely, extremely important, but I wouldn't want to get lost in that and think, if you focus all your energy on that specific component and don't address that we're still over-reliant at the end of the day as an end user, then we're in really bad shape. So.
Right. My name is Felicia Alexander. I'm with Grace's grassroots organization for accommodations for sustainable energy. So, at any rate, in anticipation of coming here tonight, I did a huge amount of condensed research all night long, last night and today, and was reading about these CHP systems, the combined heat and power systems, and how incredibly efficient and effective they are. I guess Syracuse University has had one put in place. And when you were giving your presentation and speaking of reducing the loss that we have due to inefficient systems, I was wondering, first of all, I did not have the time to explore the cost of that thing. That's one of the things that I was remiss on, but I wondered if you felt that these were effective ways that we could move forward in our efficiency department. And also that I had just as little research and found that the Department of Energy is, according to the President's State of the Union Climate Action Plan, is now committing to a certain amount of millions of dollars to help state, local, and tribal initiatives. And that came out on the 7th of the last month, and I don't know if there's any way that we can kind of tap into that as communities or anything like that. So those are two separate points, but since I only have one chance, I thought I'd bring them both up. Okay.
So on the second piece, I don't know the specifics of how that funding from the President's Climate Action Plan fits, so I don't have a quick answer for that. On the combined heat and power side, there's huge benefits to, I mean, essentially going back to the upstream situation with the inefficiencies in a central plant, and then significant percentage of that electricity, significant amount of the emissions at that plant are just wasted, right? And then line losses across the transmission system, you lose more. You lose more when you get to the distribution system. Remember, that's like the little wires that come to your house. So by the time you got there, I mean, the percentages are terrifying of how much you're not even getting out of the energy that you burn in the first place. So while combined heat and power systems do burn natural gas, they do so at an insanely high efficiency number compared to a central generation plant. Plus, they're located close to load, so you don't have the line losses. So while they are still using natural gas, they're using it at a much, much higher, sometimes 70, 80% efficiency.
Right, that's
And NYSERDA does actually have programs right now to provide incentives for those systems to get built. So there's incentives in place that a lot of municipal customers, commercial customers have looked into, and universities are definitely a logical place that they've been put in place. So there's significant emission reductions.
The article that I was reading said that that these systems are perfectly capable of using renewable resources.
Right,
to
right,
fuel them.
yep.
That the one in Syracuse is a natural gas utilizing facility, but that they are completely capable of
Right.
using renewables.
And sustainable biomass
Right.
sources, things like that. And then the other piece of this is it's not just the electric side, it's the thermal benefit you get. So picture an old building that's getting inefficient electricity delivered, and it's got a number 6 oil boiler belching in its basement for heat. So now instead you're getting electricity from that combined heat and power system, and then also the waste heat's captured and utilized, so you're reducing your demand for a much more polluting thermal source. So that's why there's really gains on the emission side from both of those. But I'll turn it over to the physicist to break it down for you.
Yeah, there's really not a whole lot more to add. The combined heat and power for large industrial users, Cornell just recently replaced its old coal burning plant with a combined heat and power. If you can make it work, it is incredibly efficient. Cortland did look at this. The one difficulty is your electric load and your heating demand have to be in the right balance. Cortland turns out to use too little electricity to make it work. Our heating demand is huge and our electric load is relatively small. So the balance didn't technically work for us. But a place like Cornell, which has a large electric load and a large heating load, essentially their heat is coming as free waste heat that it's recapturing. So it's a hugely efficient technology where it can be used.
Brice, I really appreciate your
showing us how SUNY Cortland was able to write a real plan. It didn't seem that hard. I know Cornell is in the process of finishing their real plan. My question is, and maybe this is more for you who live in the political world than the academic world, why didn't New York write a real plan?
Well, I guess to kind of state, some of these answers will probably be really obvious and not very satisfying, but just to speculate, I think you probably had a lot of different, the State Energy Planning Board, if you just look at it, it's made up of agencies beyond just the DEC and NYSERDA. It had economic development folks, it had DOT, it had Homeland Security, it had all these things. That's not an excuse for why the plan ended up the way it was. I'm just pointing out that there was a lot of different interested agencies. There are a lot of political considerations that were made that lead to any document like this. So that's not rocket science. It's not anything you probably didn't already think of, but it's just, I mean, that's the only answer that I can really come up with. Again, I think the good news is we have the really good initiatives in there. It's kind of like they almost finished their assignment. And that's good, because I mean, it could have been that there was no initiative. I mean, it could have been completely hollow, right? It could have said nothing about 80 by 50. It could have said nothing about the efficiency and renewables. And so the good news is, because in the work I do, if you don't stay optimistic, you'll kill yourself, is that there's a lot of really good pieces. And so our approach to this is pointing out those, saying finish the assignment, model the 15 initiatives, do an economy-wide wedge analysis, turn the state energy plan into a economy-wide climate action plan, build on it, make the plan itself better, and then finish the assignment and go on to do to basically complete the climate action plan, which is on a really good path. I mean, the climate action plan that was done in 2010 included a complete electrification of all buildings. There was no more oil being burned, there was no more gas being burned to heat buildings by 2050. And your electric system, your supply, went dramatically cleaner and zero carbon, because you're now displacing those thermal emissions at buildings, which is a huge source of emissions when you add it all up. That's why that one big bar that I said was residential, commercial, industrial, that's not only the electric demand in those buildings, it's also the thermal demand. And so those sorts of things are already, the wedge analysis like SUNY Cortland has for their plan was done as part of the climate action plan, and it got to 83%. And so what we need to do is bridge the gap, which unfortunately was done under a different governor, which is always a little tricky when you're talking about something that was done under a different administration. But again, the good news is Governor Cuomo did renew Executive Order 24, that New York is committed to an 80 by 50 track. So there's a lot of good news that I feel like shouldn't get lost, that should be reinforced, and we should build on that and push for the final plan to finish the job.
Which could be that plan that was already planned.
Since we've ventured into the political realm, I'm Carol Chalk. I'm from the Tompkins County Legislature, and I do want folks to know, first I want to welcome both of you here. Thanks for coming. I want people to know that last night, the Tompkins County Legislature did pass its own resolution, the 10-4 vote, weighing in on the New York State Energy Plan. It'll be posted on our website soon. If I have any energy left tomorrow, I'll bring it up and read it in Syracuse. But it, and we made, some of these points. There are a few we probably left out if we'd heard you first. It does seem as though we are required as a populace to become scientists, to learn about every aspect as this goes along. And it's my impression that was not what was intended in the establishment of New York State energy organizations. There's a whole system in place. The Public Service Commission exists, presumably to defend the interest of the ratepayers. My question has to do with what more can we do? I mean, we will distribute that Tompkins County resolution. I hope people will take it back to their towns. We're hoping it'll be something of a model for all of the other counties and municipalities around the state, other organizations who need to have templates in the whereas resolved format rather than the comment format to use. But short of that, what are the things that you see, particularly you, Jackson, and you, Brice, from your perspectives, that are most effective for people like us who aren't scientists and who aren't working in it day to day to do as these kinds of policies are developed?
So I'll maybe tackle sort of the educational side of it, and that's maybe a way we can slice this pie. I would say that it's not just about energy, but I think we're entering a time where scientific literacy is simply crucial to be a member of society. That you have to understand biology and genetic modification if you want to shop at the grocery store now. And so that to be you know, sort of a participatory part of society, science literacy is critical. And I think the focus on STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, you know, a few years ago, nobody knew what that term meant. I think people are beginning to realize that this is critical, that if you don't know kilowatt hours and BTUs, if you can't speak the lingo, you really are going to miss important things that are happening in society. I think this type of event is quite remarkable. You know, a relatively small group of people who cared a great deal about, you know, getting public engagement with a rather esoteric energy plan, you know, have pulled this together, and as a community, I was sort of used to academic talks. You walk in, maybe 3 people are there. You know,
Unless there's pizza.
Right. You can get the students if there's food, but you know, to have this many people come out, I think it shows that there's certainly the willingness and the interest to engage these ideas. That type of education, though, is really a lifetime process. The institute where I worked, Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, it did what is called public interest science. They published a journal called Science for Democratic Action, and the idea is that if you wish to do this kind of work, that you can reach out to people of like minds who are experts in the field, who can provide that kind of support. And that's really where sort of my heart lies, that to be able to do this kind of work, you know, that's why we can have you know, people who have their full-time academic jobs and really care, though, to make time for the application, because if we don't get it right, if we don't make these changes, then all the paper we produce is not going to make any difference in the end.
And you know, I don't have a whole lot to add, but I mean, the real short answer is you're doing it. I mean, everybody that came here today. What's that?
Can I get my life back one day?
No, but I mean, in all seriousness, I mean, the fact that everyone's engaged and is willing to try and wrestle. I mean, the struggle is, the problem is more than just energy. Energy's a big part of it, and it's so damn complicated that you start looking into it, you start peeling back the onion, and you're like, I don't have like 3 weeks to figure out what this means. I've got to go to work, I've got to raise my family, but we can't afford to not. And so I think the challenge is it's just really, really complicated. The issues are so dense, and they're not conducive to citizen engagement. I mean, the Public Service Commission proceedings that you've been involved in are where I spend a lot of my time. It's pretty intense, and it's complicated, and it's very resource intensive. And so I think it's just critical that that folks that are engaged can rely on groups that are willing to help bring them into the process. I mean, we've had a lot of discussions about the issues around the Cayuga situation, the Dunkirk situation, And, you know, navigating that space is not easy, but the navigation is important. It can only happen if we have engagement by everybody in New York on this, and holding lawmakers accountable and not giving up because it's complicated, and focusing on the opportunities to actually impact the outcomes, which is easier said than done. But I don't want you sounded too discouraged when you asked your question, so I don't want you to get discouraged, because we can't afford that. You know, everybody's got to stay after it, and hopefully we can push to get a better, you know, state energy plan in place.
Hi, I have sort of two different things. One is whether the plan includes anything around educating people in general about things we can do that will add greatly to our energy, to decreasing our consumption. And I know, for instance, where I live, I haven't considered getting PV panels because the two of us use so little electricity, it doesn't seem to make any sense to put in that investment when our electric bill is like $24 a month. So, so that's kind of one question. And then the other thing that is sparked because someone, I don't know where and when, quite a while ago, who was talking about photovoltaic and saying that, and this is what I'd like to see, because I'm glad you're pointing out that they are not considering the methane from gas production. However, I'd like to see the figures on taking into consideration all the emissions and other destructive effects from sustainable energy things, because this person was saying that PV uses, I don't know if it does now, but this was some years ago, uses resources that create a lot of destruction where the resources come from, and some pollution, I don't know how much. So I think it would be important to look at everything that way, to really know, like, are we sort of pie in the sky to some extent? And are we gonna just wanna go ahead and use whatever electricity and transportation and go as far as we're used to going because it's from some, quote, alternative source? Or are we really gonna know, like, what are the impacts of those panels, and what are the impacts of those windmills, and what are the impacts of all this stuff, so we really know what's going on?
You're absolutely correct. The life cycle for all technologies is crucial. And if you're interested, there are quite a lot of resources that are cited in the Cortland plan that look at the life cycle for the different technologies. The solar panels are most likely, they were talking about some of the cadmium telluride, where they have some of the rare earths or less common materials. When you look at the life cycle overall, the emissions from the kind of solar PV or wind turbines we're talking about, they are orders of magnitude less than any of the fossil technologies. They're not zero, and I think that's important. That's one of the reasons why you see it going down to 83% reductions, 92% reductions. What's left is mainly those remaining life cycle emissions in the renewable technologies and other things. The fossil fuels are basically gone, but the renewables aren't zero overall. Over time, some of those emissions will go down if you're making the solar panel with electricity from other renewables. Those residuals go down. But it's also something that people are very aware of. One of the major cost reductions in solar was driven by a desire to reduce the amount of silicon that's used in conventional silicon panels, and they've dramatically cut the amounts of material used by better manufacturing processes. And for them it was an economic win, but also an environmental win, because they reduced the amount of resources used in the panels. With wind, there are issues with some of the rare materials used in the magnets and the turbines. And again, people are very aware of this. They're looking at recyclability, reusability. You're not burning the wind turbine, so at the end you get it back and you can try to make reuse. But also new designs that might reduce some of those numbers. It's a very active and engaged area. And I think that the renewable and alternative world has really embraced that, and where we're lagging is for the rest of the fuel cycles to sort of catch up to that cradle-to-grave perspective.
And I would just add, amen, that you have a $24 electric bill, you're my hero. And second of all, just that I think what you do is it reinforces the need not to just get so focused on the supply side of the equation. We need to squeeze every drop of efficiency out from the demand side while simultaneously attacking the carbon intensity and the greenhouse gas emissions from the supply. So it's there, but you can't do one or the other. I mean, I think it's a great point.
And the one thing that reminds me is if you have not heard of Amory Lovins, the Rocky Mountain Institute, he has the perfect, concise way to say this is the cleanest kilowatt hour is the one you never consume. And so that's where we start, and then we worry about cleaning the supply side for what we can't get rid of.
Or using nuclear power to generate electricity is like trying to cut butter with a chainsaw.
Before the next question, I just want to say something about the schedule and the timing. We have to be completely out of the building by 9 o'clock, and it'll take us about half an hour to put all the chairs away and the tables back the way they were. So if we could end this in about 10 minutes, that would give you a 10 or 15-minute time to chat among yourselves as you leave, and give us time to finish up. So, yeah, a few more questions.
Thanks, Eric.
Hello. My name is Harrison. I'm a student at Hobart College up in Geneva, public policy major. And my question for you is, we have two landfills near Hobart. We have Seneca Meadows and the Ontario County landfill. If I'm correct, methane comes from those landfills. So my question is there a way to harness that energy? And if so, is that in the plan?
There is. It is considered in the plan. It is one of the areas that is somewhat contentious in terms of naming. It is included under the renewable wedge. Counting trash that you threw away and then let rot as renewable is sometimes questioned. But setting that aside, they do look at that in the plan. And at the Seneca Meadows, I believe, they do have some methane capture and production. If you look at the facility sort of across the street, there's the power plant that runs the methane pipes under it. I don't know exactly how much of the methane it captures because they do still have the vents, but they do landfill methane. It's economically advantageous for them to do that because it's much cheaper than dealing with the furtive emissions. So it is in the plan. It's hidden under the renewable energy wedge is where you would find that.
And just to tack onto that, it's not, it is eligible right now under the state's existing renewable portfolio standard. So essentially under the main tier of the RPS, the main tier is for your big wind projects, utility scale biomass, and landfill projects can compete. But just to kind of ground it, it's not gobbling up all of those incentives. I think over 80% of the RPS main tier has gone to wind farms. And so there is some, but it's pretty limited, and even in just the business as usual build out, it's not a huge chunk of expectation that there's going to be this massive move to get more landfills and then more. But yeah, but it is eligible under the RPS. So, and I don't know if the other landfill I mentioned has done it yet or not, but there is that incentive for folks to bid in.
Hi, my name's Todd Sadler. I do green building design here in Ithaca. But my question is that I'm going to try to write some comments, and I hope everybody here is going to. But do you have any advice on, I don't know how this process works. I mean, if 1 million people send in comments, and what tips do you have for writing them in such a way that's going to be most helpful, since I'm not, a noted scientist who's going to get regarded. I'm just somebody who cares about this. How do we do this to make our comments most effective?
You should all have a handout there, and one of the pages in the back of the green sheet there is where to comment on the 2014 draft state energy plan. The comment period goes until April 30th. Is that, like midnight on April 30th, 5 o'clock on April 30th? You get them in before then, because it'll take a little while. And then also as part of that packet, you will have some suggested comments. There will be a link somewhere to the slides from today. Chris McConkey, who is taping this, can that link to their slides be up
Yeah, we can
where
put,
you
I need to
post
get
the
the
video?
PowerPoints from that, but we can put that on the Shell Shock Media website. I can put that.
Did people hear that? The shellshockmedia.org.
Shellshockmedia.org.
You will, in a few days, a week, be able to see the whole presentation again. The comments, there are comments here. You can look at what came out of Tompkins County Legislature last night. And the ways to comment include snail mail and a website here to insert your comments. Anybody from the group have anything to add to that? We encourage you to do it, even if it's just a few comments, to get numbers of comments to show that it makes a difference. It will make a difference.
So we don't want you to wait till April 30th. The original deadline was March, the end of March. But you know, tomorrow is the last scheduled public hearing. But the important thing is to get writing right away. But for all your neighbors who weren't here tonight and don't have this information, we're having another program on April 23rd here about what kind of program or plan that we need in this state and how do we get there. And we'll have a lot more specific suggestions in either handouts or into various links. There's a lot of work going into this right now, so there'll be a lot of advice, and you can pick and choose what's most effective and what you're most interested in. Thank you.
Next question.
Just before that, the one last thing I would say is repetition helps an awful lot. Just because you assume everyone else is going to say something, don't leave it out of your comments. The more people say a particular comment, the more likely it is to be regarded. They're not going to really look at who sent them in. They're not going to regard a PhD any different than any other member of the public. We're all equal in that respect when it comes to public comment. And so it really is the volume that matters. When a lot of people have something that they think is very important, they're much more likely to listen than if it only comes in a few times.
Yeah, and I just want to echo that. I work directly with a lot of agency staff on a number of issues over the years. They do read all these comments, and they do have an impact. So don't feel like that you have to write a thesis and submit it and have 75,000 footnotes. Getting your comments in, and also don't feel constrained by what's in the plan. Talk about what's not in the plan. I firmly believe it's a public process. It's democracy at work, and if you don't take advantage of it, then you can't complain if you don't like the outcome. So I would just really encourage you to get them in and express your opinions on the plan. So
Looks like this is our last question.
I'm not sure how to phrase the question. We're all aware of the news and the geopolitical crisis in the Balkans.
Right up to that microphone.
And how this has not only affected that region, but Europe, since it gets its gas from Russia. And now you've already heard in the news they'll be turning to the U.S., or the U.S. will be offering gas to Europe, which will mean an increase in fracking. So we could wind up with a perfect energy plan and still see an end to the moratorium in gas fracking in the state. And I'm not sure how we deal with that. It doesn't solve the climate crisis at all.
Can I take a shot at that?
by all means.
It didn't take long for those in Washington who don't know anything about technology to weigh in and say, we're going to save the Ukraine by exporting U.S. gas in lieu of Russian gas. Let me just point out that to get gas from the United States to the Ukraine, it can only get there by being liquefied. There are currently no LNG export terminals in the U.S. As you know, there are currently, I think, 12 permitted for construction. It would take about 5 years to build one. I think the political crisis in the Ukraine will be resolved by then. So it's important to recognize when people in Washington are blowing smoke, technical smoke, hot air, and just trying to make some political capital by pointing out that we should have done this a long time ago. Last comment is, if a country wants to remain or become energy independent, it should not rely on importing energy from another country. And the best way for every country on earth to become energy independent is to use the energy it already has. And we know what kind of energy that is. I don't have to tell you. My comments.
Good.
I think also one thing to point out is right now, on the electric side again, New York currently gets about 17% of our electricity from imports from outside the state. We currently export, I believe the number is about $34 billion a year, leaves the state to support fossil fuels, whether that's oil, whether it's gas, whether it's imports. So in that hypothetical, just kind of conservative pie that we threw up at the end, that went to, the imports was down to a de minimis amount, because you're getting, as you increase those renewables resources, those are inherently local. So, and they can't be taken away.
But really quick, is there not supposed to be a ban or limitation on the exports?
I don't know. Other than there's one discussing exports.
Oh.
The discussion of whether they're going to be permitted to even export oil and stuff. It's kind of ask Lisa.
I don't know the answer to that question, and I hope it's not even discussed. It's just ludicrous to think that at this point the U.S. could come to the natural gas aid of the Ukraine.
But it's Europe that's balking at sanctions because they get their gas. And we may not get their support to overcome the crisis.
Well, far-ranging discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to call this to an end. Sarah made it very clear that we need to.
I was just going to ask just a couple quick technical questions. Probably Jackson, you know the answers. Do you know if microhydro is listed in there for the group net metering legislation? And the other one is, we haven't really used tax credits at all, federal or state, to really push for energy efficiency. Is that in the plan, and is microhydro in the plan for tax credits?
I'll speak to you after, but the short answer is microhydro would be one of the eligibility for the community projects, the group kind of community renewables. And then the tax credits is a longer answer, so I'll talk to you on that.
So I think it's important that we express our appreciation to Jackson and Brice for a fantastic congratulate yourselves on what they said. You are it. We are the solution. Thank you.